right, we're on session number 9, which is on selection of topics from modules 22, 23, and 24. We're not going to cover every element of these chapters, just the highlights, if you will, from these 3. So the cartoon says, will you stop saying ouch every time I cut something out of your budget? Budgets are painful, and that isn't a joke, that is a reality, because we are always fighting for resources, because you always think you have the best ideas for the company when in fact somebody else has a good idea now and then too. Module 22, we're going to focus on one particular item, which is budgeting, and that ends in what's called the master budget, which pulls together all the information from the sales estimate all the way through to the financial statements. Module 23, we're going to cover responsibility accounting, flexible budgets, and standard costs and variances. So this is standard costing from the standpoint of evaluating the most minute details, such as what it costs to buy a particular component in your raw materials, to the labor and other aspects necessary to manufacture products. And in Module 24, we're going to cover an important topic called the balance scorecard. We're kind of doing the greatest hits of these 3 modules as we finish up our course with managerial accounting. Let's start with Module 22, Master Budgets. Why bother with budgets at all? Well, the main reason is that it leads to a thoughtful planning process with communications, review, and approvals of plans and resource allocations. So this is the essential part of running a company, is to be able to bring together all the parts necessary to lead to the best outcomes for the company, both financially and strategically. The specifics related to this would be it requires people to think about the future so they can put it on paper and bake that into a budget. They can move a company from reactive to proactive style of management because we're looking forward instead of waiting for things to occur. We're going to improve communication and coordination because we're going to have department heads talking to their bosses and perhaps have dialogue across departments to coordinate what's going to happen in next year's activities and therefore the budgets. It provides a guide to action. So if we have a set of 20 things we're considering, but we narrow down and decide on doing 12 of them, well, it has the 12. And you can publish it and everyone would know what your 12 priorities are for the following year. And it provides a basis for performance evaluation. If you're a manager or a division president, you are promising to deliver those results on behalf of your group to contribute to the company's overall success. And finally, it aids in risk management. Risk, when we use it in this context, is not just a negative, but it's also a positive. Things can go too well, and you need to be just as ready for things going well as things going poorly. All right, management by exception. What this means is that management doesn't have the time to look at every single thing. So if there are tools enabling them to just look on an exception basis, then maybe 99% of the things that happen don't need undivided attention, but that 1% does. These are things that vary widely from plan, whether it's on a percentage basis or overall dollar amount, or just looks odd. Things out of the ordinary pattern are often worthy of management's attention. And it saves time by not requiring management to examine every single activity. Risk management, as mentioned, these are things that don't go according to plan, and they could be positive, such as sales being a lot more than you need. You might say, well, why is that a problem? Well, if you have customers that are wanting your product, you don't want to disappoint them with not having the product available. Go through a lot of effort to induce trial and get excitement, and if that doesn't translate into sales and demand that is met, you're not doing your job as a business person. Or an increase in sales price. So this might be expected to reduce sales when in fact if it doesn't, then it's a volume issue where you may not be able to meet demand. Risk is more commonly associated with things that are negatively impacting the company, such as work stoppages from a key supplier, which leave you flat-footed, not being able to produce your product, or a fire in one of your facilities, or hackers that attack your website or your databases. All too common. When we look at risk management and break it down into pieces, the first is let's identify those risks and what are the implications, again, from a positive and negative standpoint. And then we would quantify what's the probability and the impact were they to occur on the financial and other aspects of running the company. Then what's our risk response? Do we avoid the risk and we do not accept the project at all? Do we transfer the risk by purchasing insurance? Do we mitigate the risk with contingency plans? Or do we accept the risk? Just know that some risks are worth taking and based on low probabilities or low impact, we're going to move forward anyway. And risk monitoring. So we want to develop a system where we can watch for these things, so if they occur, we get as early a warning as possible. We're going to look at 4 different approaches to budgeting. One is the input-output approach, the second is activity-based approach, third is the incremental approach, and fourth is minimum level approach. And we'll go through each of these and show the pros and cons. First, input-output is where we look at things at the unit level, and this is best characterized if we're manufacturing a product. So you have raw materials, we have direct labor, so it's fairly specified what is going into each product. These could be used for service businesses as well. We mentioned that job costing allows us to price the building of a house or the conducting of a consulting exercise. Third is it works effectively where there's a defined relationship between effort and accomplishment, namely input and output. We would start with the planned outcomes and outputs, and that allows us to work backwards to say what are the inputs necessary to accomplish those outputs. A warning here is that we can only use this when it's tied directly to units. So if so, great, then let's use it. If not, it would be a stretch to do so. Activity-based approach. This is similar to ABC, activity-based costing, and it's similar to input-output in that we look at cost allocations and we charge the expected costs from the activities when they're consumed. And as we saw in last class, we look at overhead costs in the anticipated activities. Then we say what is the cost driver that best allows us to allocate the cost. And finally, we then budget based on the units of activity necessary and the cost per activity required for that particular department or product. So we would use this particular method when applicable, when we have identifiable activities, where we have cost drivers that would allow us to approximate which product or departments should be charged for those activities. Third is a fairly common approach, and it's called incremental approach. It's seeing next year's budget as a dollar or percentage increase or change from this year. And it's used when there is no real input-output relationship. It's more based on essential activities or things that are not directly tied to a product sale. And we see this used widely in government and not-for-profits. And an exact advantage is it's pretty simple. You can look at only increments, like we have 10% increase this year in our expected sales, so we expect our cost to go up by 10%. And that also ties to the big disadvantage, is that it's largely based on inertia, and the current results don't necessarily mean it was done the right way to begin with. That's the biggest problem with the incremental approach. So the warning is avoid this. I consider it a bit of a lazy approach. All right, next is look at the minimum level approach to budgeting. And here we have a baseline of what do we need to do for the functioning of the department at all, and then we add to that. We start with the idea that every single expenditure has a purpose and therefore can be explained, but it's time consuming. Instead of saying, oh, last year we spent $1 million, next year it's 10% growth, let's spend 1.1 million, done, let's go to lunch, right? Instead, we have to say, last year we had $1 million, we've analyzed those expenditures, and of those, these activities and expenditures that were worthwhile doing and still are needed to accomplish this coming year's goals. And here's some new projects and expenditures we think would do a better job for us going forward. That's more minimum level approach. Variations are zero-based budgeting, ZBB, and this is where every dollar must be justified. Zero-based means you start with zero, and every single element of your budget has some justification. And it breaks the total budget into programs and packages of them with related costs. Budgeting for objectives. So this is similar in that we're combining activity-based and zero-based in order to get to a range of outcomes and how to plan the expenditures to accomplish. So this is the best approach that we can use. A combination of unit costing is strong for those directly tied to products, and then otherwise we would use zero-based budgeting or a combination of zero-based and activity-based.